You're listening to Passions and Prologues, a literary podcast where each week I'll interview an author about a thing they love, how it inspires their work. I'm your host, Adam Sokol, and if this is your first time joining in, thanks so much for being here. If you've been here for a while, thanks for coming back. Today's episode is a big one. It is with children's author Cornelia Spelman, who has sold millions of copies of her exceptional books all about emotions, things like When I Feel Good About Myself, When I Feel Jealous, When I Feel Sad, When I Feel Scared. They are really, really important books for children to understand and process the emotions that they're going through and learning to comprehend them perhaps for the first time. I wish I would have had these books when I was younger. I was a very emotional child, and I think these would have helped a lot. Cornelia has a new book coming out, or that has come out. It is a memoir titled Missing, and it is a beautifully written portrait of a mother and her family. She kind of looks at her own mother's life in this way that I think everyone will really understand and be able to resonate with. The conversation that we have today really is the core and was the jumping off point for her writing this memoir. It's all about not specifically a family heirloom, but a thing that was passed down from generations. And it's something that over time acquired meaning in an unexpected way for Cornelia. And it's something I thought a lot about during this conversation because I was thinking back to in my parents' house, which I happen to be recording this episode, and thinking back to all the things that as I would walk around the house as a kid, I would see that my parents probably didn't think anything of collecting them at the time. But when I think back at them, I remember them as like key components and core aspects of my childhood. So I feel like everyone has those things in your parents' houses, whether they're dolls or a menorah or a holiday decoration or a vase, something that, you don't realize is extremely important until down the line. So I think you'll really appreciate this conversation. Before we get to that, I want to give you a book recommendation. I just finished The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles. I know a lot of people have read this since it came out. I think it has like over 1 million copies sold, and pretty sure it was a Jenna book club pick. But I had just read it and I really enjoyed it. It wasn't exactly what I was hoping for, but it was very delightful. It's set in the mid 1950s and it follows brothers Emmett and Billy Watson as they're planning to leave their home in Nebraska and go find their mother in California, who has left them after their father died. And they get sidetracked almost immediately and end up going basically 1,500 miles in the opposite direction to New York City. And they talk a lot about Homer's Odyssey in this. And I don't think it's based on the Odyssey, but it has a lot of similarities. And you'll understand if you haven't read it yet when you do what I mean. So it's a little bit of a coming of age story. It's a little bit of a on the road type adventure hero's journey type of a story. But it follows several different people's points of view. And I think you'll like it. I enjoyed it. Said it was slightly different than I expected, but I really did enjoy it. If you would like some custom book recommendations from me, you can always, always, always reach out to me at passionsandprologues@gmail.com. All you have to do is show me a rating or review of the podcast that you left wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also send me the things that you're passionate about. And every single month, I will do a giveaway where I will send a bookshop.org gift card to someone that happens to send me their passions. One more quick shout out. Over the weekend, I did a macaroon baking class with my niece at a local shop. And the two people that we were paired up with, one of them happens to be the co-host of the very popular Harry Potter podcast, Swish and Flick. So that her name is Tiffany, and she was delightful. And if you aren't familiar with Swish and Flick, go check it out. Again, really, really popular Harry Potter podcast, and they do a lot of cool stuff over there. And it was kind of happenstance that we happened to be at the same place at the same time and in the same group making macaroons. And we bonded over our shared love of the Harry Potter books. Okay, that's enough housekeeping. That's enough recommendations. I am not going to have you wait around anymore. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Cornelia Spelman on Passions and Prologues.
Women's Running Stories, where we explore the intersection between running and life. Because every woman who is committed to a running journey has a story to tell, and this is where you'll find those stories. I am host and producer Cherie Louise Turner. I'm a 53-year-old runner, and together with original music by musician and runner Cormac O'Regan, we bring these inspirational stories to life. Please join us to fuel your adventures.
Well, Cornelia, I am so excited to have this conversation and so thankful that you decided to join me today. So what is the passion that you have that we're going to be discussing?
I'm thrilled to be able to talk about it because I don't know that many people who, well, I think actually everybody's interested in it, but they don't often talk about family objects, not so much heirlooms as sometimes quirky or very ordinary objects that are so fascinating to me. And I think I've always been interested in them, but perhaps I got a really big kick in the rear about it when my grandmother died. And this was not a grandmother that I knew well at all. In fact, she's mentioned in my book, Missing. Her name was Corny. When she died, we got suitcases full of objects. And when my great aunt Maude died, because my mother was the only child, we got suitcases full of objects. So, for instance, there was an evening bag of my grandmother's that still had tobacco pieces in it and a Kleenex with lipstick on it. You know, it was like, wow, this is just, it's almost like Aladdin's lamp or something that you rub it or you touch it and you're transported back into another time and place. So our house is just full of these sorts of things. And of course, a lot of them I can't get rid of. I did actually give that pocketbook away, but I gave it to my daughter and she was completely thrilled to have it. It was her great grandmother's.
So I'm also fascinated by these types of things. Like my mom growing up had these plates that were painted to look like Norman Rockwell paintings.
Yes. Oh, nice.
Yeah, and they're like reprints. They're not like the original. They'll be wonderful if they were the originals. But it's one of those things where I think my sister has them now, and like my mom is still alive and well. Like I'm literally, I told you I'm recording from their house right now. But it's one of those things where I saw it on my childhood, and like it kind of never thought twice about it. But then now that they're not there, I'm like, oh, that was a thing that was like there's probably a story behind there. So. One of the things you've written a whole memoir that we're getting into in a little bit, but there is a very specific kind of keepsake that you have that sort of sparked your interest, right?
Yes, right. You're talking about my grandfather's nameplate, his brass nameplate, and my mother kept it. And when I knew it was very precious to her, I knew that her father, whose name was Samuel Andrew Schneider, and the nameplate says S.A. Schneider in brass. I knew that she kept it because he meant a lot to her. I knew that he had died when she was a child, but really I didn't know any details at all. And I didn't even know how old she was when he died. Now, maybe she told me and I was too young to be interested, but that sat on my desk for the longest time until I suddenly thought that I'm going to find out the whole story. It was part of my finding out the whole story about what happened to my mother in her life to cause her to end in such a sad way, but also to find the whole story. And I was able to find the whole story of his death. And I traveled to Iowa. I found the bank where it had sat on his desk and went to newspaper archives and found his grave. And he meant a lot to me. And you might ask, how could he mean a lot to me since he died in 1918?
So I'd love to kind of expand on that. But first, how do you go about starting that journey? Again, before I started recording, I told you this is something I'm also really, really interested in. Like I really only know my family through my grandparents, and then like beyond there, all of my grandparents passed away when I was pretty young. So there just wasn't a lot of really, neither side of the family has like a family historian, I guess, that I'm very close to that would be able to kind of trace things further back from that. So when you're looking at this nameplate, what is the kind of, I guess, like investigative journalism that you started doing to figure out who this person was?
Well, when I started it, Adam, the internet was not really active at all. So I had to do it from scratch. I couldn't just Google it. But for instance, I knew, I'm not sure how I found out that where he died. I think I must have gone to Iowa first. I mean, my husband and I took 2 trips, and then I took another one to Iowa because I wanted to see the places, because the houses, and I had scrapbooks and stuff from my family. So that was my evidence of some of it. So I knew the addresses, the cities not cities, the little towns in Iowa where they lived. And so we traveled to see them. And while I was there, I went into the newspaper archives, and I found on the front page of the Mason City Globe Gazette in 1918 the story of my grandfather's death. So once I knew when he had died, and that he had died in Chicago, of all things, which is where I live, I went to the Vital Records office in downtown Chicago. Oh, that was such a moment. And I wrote down, I filled out a form for his name and the date of his death. And I sat down and waited. It's like, it was like the driver's license office. It was just a big, loud, crazy office. And I sat there with my heart beating a million times a minute and waited, and they called my name and handed me his death certificate. And so on that was even more information. And every bit of information you get leads you to find more information. And if you like detective stories, which I do, and I think everybody likes treasure hunts, that's really what it is. Writing a memoir about your family is like a treasure hunt.
So what made you want to go down this memoir path now? So people listening in will almost certainly recognize your name. Like, you've literally sold millions of children's books, and you have this wonderful way of writing so that children can feel like they're seen and they're understood. And
that's nice of you to say. Thank you.
Absolutely. And your books have meant a lot to me as a person who my entire life I've been a very emotional person. These books are things that I relate to even now in my mid-30s. So, but I'm wondering, what made you want to go from, writing these, again, like very successful books for children to saying, okay, I do want to tackle this, because this is clearly something that you've been passionate about for a really long time now.
Yeah. Well, really, Adam, some of it had to do with life stages. So the year that I turned 50, my daughter left for college, and I wasn't actively working as a therapist anymore. And so I bought 2 used filing cabinets, and I started organizing all the family papers, because I'd always been like you. I'd always been interested in all this stuff. So I had letters and papers and birth certificates and every photographs and everything. And so I organized them, and I just was happy as a lark working on this project to organize it. But then also less happy was my wish to figure out what happened to my mother. So she was, in the pictures that I have of her, she was a very pretty, well, not pretty, interesting looking person, a very vital, very vivid kind of person. And she was healthy and strong and smart. And yet when I knew her, that is to say the last 10 years of her life, when I was, from the time I was about 10 or 12, I guess, she was ill. And she was a very, very heavy smoker. She smoked in the morning from the time she got up till the time she went to bed. And she had a bad cough all the time I was growing up. I remember being in a school play, and I knew she was in the audience because I could hear her cough from behind stage. And then she got emphysema, a lung disease, and she never quit smoking. And she smoked herself to death, and she died at the age of only 63 from lung disease. And she was depressed, and there were a lot of problems in our family with my oldest brother. And I thought, what happened? What happened to her? And because I had worked as a therapist, and because I understood child development by then much better than I would have, I think, otherwise, and because I'd been a mother, I began to understand that it was probably the impact of her father's sudden death. And so I wanted to start there. and figure that out. And I believe I did. I mean, you could argue, well, how could you possibly prove that his death was the cause of her problems? Well, it wasn't the only cause. But when children have a traumatic loss, as she did, of this unexpected, completely unexpected death of a parent who probably was the more loving parent, because her mother was quite cold and remote and judgmental. And my mother was an only child. So I think in a way, all my children's books that you mentioned are intended to prevent the kinds of problems with children having losses and never being able to talk about them or never being able to talk about their feelings. And my mother smoked instead of feeling.
Yeah.
That's how I understand it.
This it's pretty close to home. When I was growing up, I had a really close friend, and he and I were present when his father unexpectedly had a stroke and passed away. And I think we were 11, maybe 10 years old at the time. And we went to what I now know was therapy. But for us, it was just like we thought we were going to almost like a day camp or something where we would kind of talk about feelings and draw and things like that. But we only went for a little while. I mean, our parents did the absolute best for us. And like, I'm really proud of how I turned out. My friend he has had like some issues in life, and I know a lot of it stems from whether it's pent up anger or pent up frustration, whatever it might be. But like, I think you're right. Like, I do think, while maybe you this many years out can't officially diagnose that's what happened to your mother, but I would imagine with the experience that you have in your entire career, like, these things are really how people cope, like whether it is smoking or alcohol or, some people turn to art, whatever it might be. Like, there is a void there that you have to try and fill, I would imagine.
Well, turning to art, of course, would be a healthy adaptation. And, addiction is not just mental for most people. It's also physical. People are born with the tendency to alcoholism, or they can get a physical dependence on it or other drugs. But if there's someone in our life that we can talk to honestly, and that will be with us no matter how we feel, that they'll take it, whatever we have to say, they'll take it, we'll be okay. That I strongly believe. I mean, the only exception would be some mental illnesses that are, again, physically based. And so just talking with somebody might not be enough for them, or depression, where people often would need medication too. But the talking and listening is, in my experience in life, the key to healthy life.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I'm a massive proponent of therapy. I've been going to therapy basically weekly for the last 8 months or so. And it has helped me so much, not only in the ability to speak with someone about what's going on in my life and how it's affecting me, and learning to better understand that cause and the things that I do don't cause other people to feel a certain way. Like, it's actions and reactions and all these different things. But more specifically, it's helped me better communicate with my family. Like, I can kind of understand where they're coming from and things a lot better. And, that I can understand when I'm saying something. And if they're getting frustrated, I can better understand why. See, I fully agree with you about how important it is just to be able to talk to someone about certain things. And I guess I'm curious to kind of connect that to missing, to connect it to the memoir you're writing, without having people to talk to who were around in these situations. Like, how did you get that depth and color around the story? Was it really just finding more and more articles and letters and things like that? Or were there ways that you kind of, coped with learning all of these things while you were going?
I'm not sure I understand your question. Maybe you could rephrase it.
Yeah. So while you were writing this memoir, or I guess researching this memoir, I am assuming that there weren't really many people for you to be able to talk to about their experiences with your mother or your grandpa, who, like you said, had passed away in the early 1900s. So how were you going about creating writing down the story? Was it really just the different pieces of information you were able to find, or were there ways that you were able to kind of flesh out the story even further?
Well, it took me a very long time, many, many years to write it because it was such a psychological and emotional journey, not only finding out the information, but processing it. I mean, for instance, when I started off, I couldn't remember until I got my mother's death certificate, the exact date of her death. I wasn't even sure of the exact year because it had been so upsetting, and I had had difficulties in my own life after that and was a single mother, and there was so much to deal with that it wasn't until I turned 50 really that I could turn around and look back and try to make sense of a lot of things that happened. But I did have my husband of 41 years. He was certainly a great help to talk to, and I do remember one occasion when I came to him crying and sat on his lap and cried again about all the sad things that had happened in my family. And he said, "I really hope, Cornelia, that this book will exorcise them for you." And it did in many ways, because I think making sense of things that seem chaotic is a really important coping strategy. And for me, the filing cabinets, I just think are one of the greatest inventions in the world, because you can keep everything straight. Mm-hmm. And so being able to organize, I'm sure it's a question of gaining control. By organizing and researching and writing, you're gaining control over a situation that you had no control over. And then also, certainly I've been to therapy myself. Most good therapists, I certainly hope, have been to therapy themselves. So, but good friends or a loving spouse or partner are awfully important.
So we talked about the fact that this whole journey of the book really started with this nameplate, and I'm curious. I remember when my grandmother on my mom or my dad's side of the family passed away. She had dementia for a lot of my life, so I never really got to know her. When she passed away, my aunt said, "Hey, Adam, Grandma had all these old books, and I know that you're a very literary person. Would you like to kind of look through them?" So, yeah, absolutely. And so I always have loved Russian literature. Even like when I was in high school, it made no sense why I was reading like the Brothers Karamazov at 16, mm-hmm. But I really always loved those books. And I was able to look through my grandmother's books, and I discovered like she had all of these old Russian novels, and they were, they were like copies she bought from the library. So they weren't like, it wasn't like they were worth anything, but they were worth a lot to me. Cause I was like, oh my gosh, my grandmother was reading the plays of Ibsen or, stories by Tolstoy. And so to me, like those, I still have those. Again, they're just, really worthless, tattered versions, but to me, they mean a lot. So while you were kind of going through and organizing all of these things, in addition to the nameplate, like were there other, we can call them heirlooms or keepsakes, that you discovered that are really sentimental to you now?
Oh, many. But I want to just say about your story that it's such a good example, Adam, of how, by reading the books that your grandmother read and that were important to her, it was a way to get to know her, because you could see what she was interested in, and you're literally reading the words that she was reading. So I can really understand how that makes sense. And I have, in fact, some prayer books of both my mother and grandmother, and, there would be bookmarks in them. And I was so curious, why did they bookmark this? I wonder why they bookmarked that. But I have so many keepsakes, photographs, a lot of photographs. And I remember even as a child, I was the one who would collect them and write in pencil on the back when they were, and ask my father about them. I remember doing that from a very young age. I have pieces of silverware. Like I have a spoon that belonged to my grandmother Corny, and it's just a beautifully made old silver spoon, and it says her name on it. And in those days, among some people, they would make silver spoons as kind of like a graduation present or as some other birthday present. And I do have a lot of old books, also some of them when I was a child, that are precious to me. But my mother's possessions, though, it's funny, the things that can have meaning. I kept her eyeglasses for a long time, and that was kind of creepy, really, because the idea of glasses with sightless eyes, the person's dead.
Mhm.
It kind of freaked me out, and I eventually got rid of them, but I had kept them because I was with her when she died. And a more pleasant kind of heirloom was an old bracelet that she had, and it was just costume jewelry. But I can remember her saying, "Oh, I love this. Look at this beautiful color." It was a kind of green fake stone. And my daughter played with that bracelet, and my granddaughter played with that bracelet. So even though it's not something that's valuable monetarily, it's something that conveys some sense of the person. But really, the whole house is filled with objects which have meaning either to my family or to me, including old furniture. And I thought recently, well, our house looks like an old person's house. And I thought, well, yeah, because we're old and our furniture's old. And our life was, our life happened in a different time. And I have my great grandmother's table. And in the drawer, on the bottom of the drawer, there's written the name Ferguson in pencil, because that was one of the family names. Somebody from way back wrote that in there. I love that stuff.
I love that so much. The one that I have is my grandpa was in the Navy, and I have his sailor's hat. And
great.
It's so interesting to me just because it's so small. Like it doesn't fit it doesn't fit my dad's head. It doesn't fit mine. And so to me, like, it's that ability to understand the size of my
that's
grandpa.
a really good example. Yeah.
And it's like, I never met this man. He passed away before I was born, but like, I can picture what he looked like and everything because of the size of this hat.
Yes. Yeah, that's great.
So I love to ask, like, once you have collected all of the information, I always like to ask people who've written nonfiction when they know it's time to start writing and stop researching. Was it something that you were writing along the way, or was there a moment where you said, like, okay, I have as much of a story as I can possibly?
Oh, there were many, many moments. I mean, for me, it was gathering the information and going off in a lot of different directions. And I think the biggest challenge in writing the book was that I had so much material.
Mm-hmm.
And which story would I tell? Like, I had one friend who said, "Oh, I would have written a whole book about your brother."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "No, that was not what I was interested in. I was interested in the stories about my mother." And I think for me, it was a process of gathering and writing, and then also really trying to, for any piece of writing, trying to really hone in on what is your preoccupation here? What's going on here? What are the almost the jewels that you're putting together? And I use a thesaurus often because words will help me so much. Like, I had a whole sheet of different words related to the word missing. What was missing? What was recovered? Recuperation, rehabilitation, healing, empty, all different kinds of words all the way around. That's how I eventually ended up with the title Missing, because one of the earlier titles had been The Faint Sound of a Human Heart. That had come from a newspaper article about an earthquake in Mexico City and how the rescue dogs listened for the faint sound of a human heart. I thought that was such a touching image. And I thought that's what I was doing in writing this book. I was listening to understand my mother's heart.
How do you feel now, having written it and having it out in the world?
I'm so happy to be able to talk about it, because it's, it's obviously not a book that's like just a fictional book about a story that's not related to me. Although, of course, I'm sure everybody's fiction is, in one way or another related to them. But I would say I feel finished with her particular story, but I'm not finished with all the things around it. And in fact, I'm writing another memoir now, which is definitely related to it. And that's been really fascinating for me. I'm very glad I didn't get rid of those files, because I have so many filing cabinets, Adam. I got 2 more. I have 4 filing cabinets.
Well, I will say, so people won't be able to see this, but right behind you, there is a filing cabinet. And I mentioned I'm at my parents' house right now. I'm going to turn my camera over a little bit. There's literally a filing cabinet right next to
and a red one.
Yeah, it's
red?
So it's like orange.
Orange, I like it. See, here's a little tiny one over my shoulder.
Yeah, my
That's
father, before he retired, he was a State Farm insurance agent. And before everything got digitized, they had these, he had, oh my gosh, thinking back to his office, I bet there were 20 of these in there at least. And so I think he eventually...
Can't have too many.
I think he eventually sold most of them, but it is funny. I'm sitting in his kind of office, and he still uses it. You're absolutely right. It's super helpful for him. I'm also curious, and this might be a weird question or a very quick answer. Does writing these memoirs, does it feel in any way like writing the children's books that you've written in the past, or does it feel just like a wholly different experience for you?
It's not wholly different. I think it's definitely related. I'm not sure I understood when I began writing the children's books, because the first one was 1996, I think, 1998. I'm not sure I understood when I began. Of course, I didn't know that I was going to do a whole series at that point. But I realized that I was writing them for my mother in some ways. I was writing them for the children that I had worked with in therapy. I could see a very plain need. And I was well aware that as a child, I could have used them. Any child could use knowing more about emotions and how to deal with them. But then I saw, I see, it's so related because the jewels that one thinks about or that one writes about or that are one's themes are the same in the children's books as they are in the memoir. That is, how talking and listening help. Every single one of those books tells a child, talk to somebody or be close to somebody. And this is how we manage feelings. We tell somebody, we have a feeling in our body, we tell somebody and we get comfort and direction. And then we know how to manage it. So it's really all of a piece.
That's such an interesting way to think about it, because I think it sounds like, at least having this conversation with you, that you said you feel like this, you kind of told this part of the story, and you do sound like you're very much at peace, which I imagine, having spent so much time working on a memoir, I would imagine you would have to feel at peace having put it out in the world. But does it feel, and maybe this is a quick answer because of the fact that you're working on a second memoir, but I've had a lot of people tell me when they spend a lot of time writing a book and then they put it out into the world, it's almost like they've lost a part of themselves because that thing is no longer theirs. Was there that feeling of like loss putting this out into the world, or was it because you have another one you want to work on and another story you want to tell? It was mainly just like, okay, I'm at peace with this and it's time to move on.
I understand that feeling of loss because it is such a part of you for somebody who's written a book, but it feels like a gain to me rather than a loss, because it gives me the opportunity to connect to more people like with you today, where we can talk about things that aren't necessarily about the book, but that are about the book, because the book is about life and how people relate to each other. I was aware, and in one of the last chapters, when I took my mother's diaries, and I forgot to mention those, by the way, in terms of heirlooms. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Her 3 diaries from when she was a little girl and then a teenager. But when I took them to the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America, which is where they live in perpetuity and anybody can go and see them, and I left them there, then I felt very sad. I remember turning at the door and looking back at the little pile of her things that I'd brought. And then when I went outside, I cried because I felt that I had really left her behind, even though by then she'd been dead for probably 20 years already, maybe more.
And speaking of her diaries, was that something that she passed on to you?
No, it was I don't even remember where we found them. The household was moved after she died. I had 2 sisters and they got some and I got some of stuff, and a brother who got some stuff. But I don't think that anyone had looked at them except me, because again, I was interested. I mean, I have one sister who certainly would have, maybe both sisters would have, but when I found them, I was just so thrilled. But, Adam, when I was younger, too, younger people aren't always interested. I get that. They're in the middle of living their lives. And, they don't necessarily care about their mother's diary or their mother's life or their grandmother's life. It takes a certain amount of years for one to get interested because it doesn't seem real to you when you're young. You think, well, they didn't, it's so irrelevant in some ways that you had grandparents and that your grandparents were young people or even children. So it's really a treasure. You just don't ever throw anything away.
Yeah, I know, but I know exactly what you mean because I feel like, especially over the last 5-10-ish years, I have felt that way. Like my parents have been, they've gotten really good at not emptying their house, but
clearing out.
Just basically because they didn't want, God forbid something were to happen. They're like, we don't want to leave you guys with just this pile of stuff.
Sure.
But in reality, which is in reality though. So I'm the youngest of 4 siblings, and I wouldn't say all of us are pack rats, but I would say we all we would definitely. There are lots of things, and I'd be like, oh yeah, I would absolutely. I would take that from you, Mom. Don't get rid of that for sure. But I'm just laughing, thinking about my mom hearing this, us saying, don't ever throw anything away. And then she's like, I just don't want any of this clutter. Let's just get rid of all of it. But
one gets tired of the clutter, but it turns out that some of that clutter is absolutely gold.
Yeah.
And an archivist at the library in Iowa said to me, well, Cornelia, do you have letters between your grandparents? They must have written a lot of letters. And I hadn't thought about that. I didn't have them. And I thought, darn, where did they go? Did my grandmother throw them out? Did my mother throw them out at some point, saying whoever wants? Because think of the written record that people before us left behind, if only we could get there. All the letters that must have been written back and forth.
So speaking of that, on your website, it mentions that you have over 250 of your own diary. So do you still have all of those as well?
No, they're at the library. They're at the Schlesinger Library, which, to my delight, wanted them. Now, my diaries are closed and not open to anybody to read until the year 2070. My mother's are open and all of her papers are open, but I write them and send them off to the library after I get a few together. So I'm actually on volume 252.
Incredible. That is amazing.
But Adam, before I found that the library wanted them, which was, of course, the most thrilling thing that's ever happened to me, I think, was for them to want them, I kept them in my filing cabinet. But I would get worried because I wanted to be able to write whatever I wanted and not hurt anybody's feelings. And, what if I dropped dead and I had written something that I could never explain to somebody? So I urge anybody to keep a diary because it's such a helpful thing to do, but make sure you have a lock and key and, or decide, do you want somebody to see this or don't you? If you can skip a generation, probably anybody could write anything.
252. Wow, that is incredible. That is so amazing. Okay, so the last question for you, I always ask people who come on to end the show with a recommendation. It could be a book that you love. It could be a recipe. It could be, a movie that you've recently seen. Just something that you'd like to recommend that people enjoy after they listen to this conversation.
Well, I don't know if there are any people who love fountain pens out there.
My first guest, Mallory O'Mara, she's a good friend of mine. She loves a fountain pen, so this will be very applicable for her.
I think fountain pens are one of the great pleasures of life. And you can get catalogs from pen stores. There's a kind of whole world I'm not part of because I don't collect things, I use them, but you can get these catalogs from the pen stores and look at pictures of pens and look at all the different kinds of inks. And I have to add that my grandmother Corny was a teacher of handwriting in the Mason City, Iowa public schools. And she had beautiful handwriting and my mother had beautiful handwriting. And my husband tells me my handwriting is beautiful, although it's a little not as good as it used to be. But my daughter writes by hand. My granddaughter, who knows if she'll even write cursive? I don't think they even necessarily teach it in schools anymore.
Yeah. So is there I'm going to make an addendum to the last question thing. Is there like a specific fountain pen that you do like, or is it just like?
Yes,
Yeah.
Pelican.
Mm-hmm.
A Pelican fountain pen is absolutely the best fountain pen I've ever used. Now, maybe there are more that are more expensive, though. It's not cheap.
Mm-hmm.
It always writes. It always flows beautifully. And it's a pleasure to hold in your hand.
That's absolutely perfect. Cornelia, I feel like I could talk with you for hours and hours.
I do too. It was fun.
I enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
Passions and Prologues is proud to be an evergreen podcast and was created by Adam Sokol. It was produced by Adam Sokol and Sean Rule Hoffman. And if you are interested in this podcast and any other evergreen podcast, you can go to evergreenpodcast.com to discover all the different stories we have to tell.